Welcome to the 11th episode of the Haunted Hills podcast. I'm your host, Tegan Dawson. In this episode, I share the history of the ghost town that is Yallourn. Hear about the doctor, nurse, boilermaker, welfare workers, fundraisers, and the backbone of Yallourn. I like to focus on the people, because the town creates commonality between the people, building relationships through the need for products, services, and industry. The people make the town. In 1918 to 1919, the site selected for creating the township labourers and engineers operating the power stations would live in was named Yallourn. The name is a joining of two indigenous words from the traditional custodians, the Gunai Nations people. Yallourn, meaning brown, Luan, meaning fire. In 1931, there was discussion to honour Sir John Monash for his work on the town, by renaming it to Monash. Sir John Monash passed away in October 1931. We know the town remained named Yallourn. Sir Monash instead was honoured by a monument erected in the town square for him in 1932, which had a huge turnout for its unveiling. And further to honour his memory, in 2018, the Victorian electoral boundary, Macmillan, was changed to Monash. The traditional custodians of the land are the Briakalong people of the Gunai Nation. The first person we're going to meet is the wife of a civil engineer from 1920. Henrietta Kazaka was born in Liverpool, UK in 1898 to Gustav Kazaka, who was born Ukraine to Isaac and Lviv Kazaka. From the records, Gustav looks like he is of Jewish descent. He immigrated to Liverpool working as a theatrical agent. In 1903, father and daughter became naturalised UK citizens. At some point, Henrietta moved to France. It's possible her father moved there with her. It was here she met Ralph Alec Hunt while he was serving in World War I. In 1919, they applied for free passage for her to Australia on a fiancé visa. Ralph was born in 1891 to Henry, a solicitor, and Wilhelmine Jane in Brighton, Victoria, a suburb of Melbourne. Ralph stood at 5 foot 7 inches tall. He'd recently graduated his civil engineering with honours from Melbourne University. When he returned from his service, the happy couple in 1920 married at a registry office in Melbourne. Ralph was 29 and Henrietta 22. Within a year they were pregnant, and on the 29th April 1921, Derek Allen joined the family. He was born in Toorak, Victoria, also a suburb of Melbourne. With their baby Derek safely arrived, Ralph took up the post of civil engineer later that year. They moved into Yallourn. The ambitious couple worked hard, taking their responsibility for building this town seriously, living in a hut since 1921 on the land where the open cut is by 1944. The kitchen and laundry were outside under the sky. Locals and journalists thought Henrietta was French. She mustn't have corrected them, as she had come straight from Paris to the windy gully that was Yallourn. She had fond memories of family life in the hut, saying they had a lot of fun and especially made sure Derek did too. The Hunts and Drummonds were great friends and started in Yallourn together. While Derek was an only child, he grew up with the Drummonds children as though they were siblings. The Hunts moved into a cottage at 36 Hillside Street, Yallourn by 1925. Henrietta was the vice president of the Yallourn Orchestral Society for many years. Sometimes she shared this role. Part of her role was helping organise subscriptions and discussing funding and spending. In 1938, with Ralph's promotion to superintendent, they were given a more beautiful home, a corner block of Nerrican Avenue, Yallourn, number 58. Corner blocks were reserved for the white-collar workers. This is described as a gorgeous 2-story home with stunning gardens, but also views of the countryside for miles around. Stairs led up to the front door, lined with potted plants, a pine tree not far from the front of the house. It was on top of a hill. It had multiple lines in the roof. Slid from the top of the second story. Above the door, the roof line came down from the top of the second story to create the veranda over the doorway. Beside that was an M in the roof line with large windows overlooking the road. The windows opened outwards. There was even an attic. A wood fireplace went through the center of the house. The front door also had a patio. You can see photos of this house on Virtually Yallourn at 58 Narrowcan Avenue, the General Superintendent's house. The photos from 1960, which is nearly 30 years after the Hunts lived there, shows it as a blue house with like sheet walls and red roof. There's more bush around it by that time. The early photos show it with low-lying bush, where in the top windows you would have seen right over it, out into the pastures around. During the Second World War, the Yallourn Women's National Emergency Fund formed on 9 September 1939 and assisted fundraising efforts for emergency services during this time. Henrietta was the president since the beginning. In 1940, one of the fundraising events she organised was a juvenile concert at the Presbyterian Hall in Yallourn in December 1939. They worked closely with Miss Freegan's pupils, Miss Freegan and her pupils. The young musicians performed to a packed house, with piano duets, dancers, violinists, children's choir. Henrietta presented the certificates to the students who completed their grades. 8 children received honours and 1 a pass. The children then had a party for their excellent work throughout the year. Between 1942 and 1943, the Women's National Emergency Fund raised £1,939. £1,040 of this went to prisoners of war. Many of the funds raised were from Yallourn households, who donated £10 per week. Henrietta said one of the hardest things about fundraising was that people wanted to get something for their money. She said this thinking should be discouraged. Henrietta may have been so passionate because her father did not move to Australia, and his name is listed in the Jewish Gen. This is a database of people of Jewish descendant, of Jewish heritage, who were believed to have been killed in World War II. His last known location is to be in Cottbus, Germany, during World War II. I can't verify exactly if it is him. However, it is a man of the same name. They didn't give an age or other identifying details, but this may be why she undertook with such passion. She felt the persecution of the Jewish people, her people. In 1944, Henrietta and her original members were given additional assistance from every other woman in town as well. In 1944, when the bushfires raged through that resulted in a royal commission, Henrietta and her original members were given additional assistance from every other woman in town. Everybody banded together to help find accommodation for those who lost their homes, clothing, and other needs. Henrietta, supported by her elected members, provided stable, supportive leadership to enable every woman a place and a role, including manning the canteen at the Yallourn Power Station to ensure the nourishment of the workers. Her experience managing the Women's National Emergency Fund had equipped her well for the bushfires. To ensure mutual aid was given to her community members through the network and organisations she'd built up. These women were the first social workers or welfare workers, fundraisers, networkers, and logistic personnel. They were not just married women. They did not just conduct home duties, as the electoral roll states, or their probate records show. Henrietta still worked for the fund, overseeing weekly events and attending the office since the beginning of the fund in 1939 until her death. Henrietta passed away in October 1945. She was described as a leader who was charming, graceful, a woman who did not need fashion to assist her in portraying this. Her style was said to be simple, however her presence made it striking. She died just missing the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, who came to hear about how her work with the Women's National Emergency Fund helped the Australian prisoners of war. A local prisoner of war had recently returned and was recovering in the Yallourn Hospital. He was said to be doing well. Their son, Derek Allen, signed up to World War II, where he served as a lieutenant in New Guinea. He came home safely and married in December 1945. He married Dorothy Eastman of Sandringham. They moved down there and lived for a long time. He worked as an architect. I've become obsessed with Yallourn as I've done this research. It's been one of the hardest towns to research, partially because the SEC owned everything. So the bakers don't live in the town. They send their bread to Yallourn for the SEC to sell in the company stores. So I will be looking at informing you more about Ralph Hunt and his impact on this town. Through his story, it touches on a lot of other stories. That will be a bonus episode coming up. It'll also look at other key members of the SEC leadership within Yallourn, and including looking at John Monash. I'm looking at creating this into an audiobook, which will eventually be available. However, it will be created on the schedule that my bonus episodes come out currently. So if you want to support this and have access to this as it comes out, and also live discussions about it, you can do so by signing up on patreon.com/hauntedhills. Yeah, there's just so much to hear about Yallourn, and I kind of understand why people are so fascinated by this town. Now we're going to look at the constabulary of Yallourn. Yallourn had a Constable Wiggins. If that name doesn't instantly hit you, you probably didn't watch The Simpsons. However, this constable did not appear to have been an inspiration for The Simpsons character. Before coming to Yallourn, the Wiggins were residing in Brunswick West. They moved just before the election in 1949, where they voted in Yallourn. Constable Kenneth William Wiggins worked at the Yallourn police station from 1949 to 1951. His wife Mary Joan had worked as a telephonist in Brunswick West until they moved. Unfortunately, that's all I know about him, apart from a few of the cases that he dealt with, which come up in our crime stories. So, because that was short, I am going to tell you about Yallourn's senior constable from 1927 until 1944. He was William Ernest, a true Gippsland local. William Ernest was born 1887 in Mabel North, that little town on the other side of the Strzelecki Ranges, to William and Alan. I'm going to call him Ernest because most people in these days went by their second name, and there are so many Williams in Yallourn, so to prevent confusion, I'm going to call him Ernest. When Ernest was 5 years old, his dad died. At 21 years old, on 19 September 1909, Ernest joined the police service in Leongatha at the St. Lawrence Catholic Church, which still stands today. He married Maud Elizabeth Canty. It was 1910. Maud was born in Yarragon on 30 November 1888 to John and Winifred. Ernest worked his posting as a constable in Malden before the wedding, and afterwards they moved there as man and wife. Their children came quick, almost like it was a horse race. Winifred Eileen was born in Malden, 1911. In 1913, William John was born in Leongatha. They called him Jack more commonly. In 1914, Veronica was born. The very next year, Patricia Mary joined the family. While they were living in South Melbourne in 1917, when he was 29 years old, Maud gave birth to Joan Therese in 1918, their third child born, Joan Therese. In 1918, their third-born child, Veronica, at 4 years, passed away. Later that year, Maud gave birth to Elizabeth Mary, better known as Betty. Brian Joseph was the last child born in Melbourne, ending their run of children in 1990, with 7 children born in 8 years. In 1920, Ernest went as a married man by himself to London via Canada. It doesn't say why. He did return home though, and when he did, the 8 members of the Collier family moved to Yallourn. William arrived as a senior constable, working from 1927. He worked here until 1942. He was kept very busy dealing with family violence, drunk and disorderly trespassers. We'll cover more of this during the Yallourn crime stories. Let's discover the family and their footprints in Yallourn during this time. Jack learned the trade of fitting. He enjoyed many sports: football, athletics, soccer, and cricket. He also served the community, like his father, but as a member of the Country Fire Brigade. The senior constable was the president for the Monster Carnival and Sports, with a total of £2,200 up for grab. A train from Melbourne would bring competitors and spectators. The meet, organised to run over 8 hours on 23 March 1931, would include motorcycle events, equestrian, running, Highland dancing for under 16s, wood chopping, plus mixed events like tug-of-war and other old games. There was also carnival games, food, and a bar. In September 1931, William was appointed as the Roman Catholic trustee of the Yallourn Cemetery, alongside Mr. Culhane. The other family members were great to the Yallourn area as well. Winifred was part of the Yallourn Sundowners Band and played many events in the Yallourn township before her marriage. In 1932, Winifred married a young man she'd grown up with in Yallourn, Horace Sheehan. They honeymooned in Lakes Entrance, which is incidentally the next small town we're going to explore. In 1935, Patricia married Walter Thomas Howard, also a police officer. She had trained as a school teacher and was registered as a retired teacher when she passed away. Joan trained as a scientist and worked as a lab tech. Brian Joseph signed up to serve in World War II, where he became a Lance Sergeant. He returned and worked as a clerk in Yallourn when he did. In 1942, Ernest received a promotion to sergeant. However, to take this post, he had to move to Benalla, where he lived with Maud until his death on 25 September 1974. His wife Maud died in 1976. The 1932 music teacher. Grace was born in 1903 to farmers Emily and Joseph, who lived in Merino, Victoria. She grew up and trained as a teacher of the piano, both theory and harmony. She was advertising in Yallourn as a private piano teacher since 1932. She also worked for the Yallourn Technical School as a music teacher. She trained many students. Also, as part of her private tuition, she also supported the Yallourn Orchestral Society, playing, and also shared her talents with the Yallourn Orchestral Society. Grace engaged with many parts of the Yallourn community. She was a member of the Country Women's Association and the Orchestral Society. It appears she enjoyed a long courtship with her future husband. In 1934, Grace and Edgar paired up on the Yallourn Golf Course. The Yallourn Golf Course is one of the few areas that still exists, because it was outside of the town limits, out of the areas designated for power stations. It's on Golf Links Road, Yallourn, off John Field Drive. In 1936, Grace rented a house at 10 Northway, Yallourn, while Edgar lived on the same street at 3 Northway, Yallourn. In 1938, there is a large utility tea. Today we'd call it a kitchen tea. So many people joined her to celebrate her pending nuptials. Their courtship finally came to fruition, and they wed. Edgar Scott was 30, and Grace Ralston was 35. They moved to Williamstown and lived with Edgar's parents until they passed, and then stayed in that property for a tiny bit longer, before returning to their roots as a couple, to the Yallourn area, however, living in Moe this time. Now we're going to look at the head teacher of the Yallourn Secondary College. William Morgan Abrams was the youngest child born in 1876 to Louis 48 and Anne 31 in Sebastopol, a suburb of Ballarat, Victoria. He was working as a teacher in the Colac, Victoria area. I'm going to call him by his second name as well. Morgan married Annabel Clarinda in Newcastle, New South Wales, when he was 31 years old on 1 April 1907. Despite the wedding being held on what we now know as April Fool's Day, their marriage did not seem to be a joke and lasted until death did them part. His teaching career took him to many parts in Victoria, including Harrietville. It's a ghost town today, but a great campsite in the Victorian High Country. He arrived in Yallourn, Victoria, around 1931, alone. His family were living somewhere else. Morgan was living in Yallourn in 1932 at 26 Broadway Avenue. 24 May 1934 was Empire Day, a day to celebrate the vastness of the British Empire and all its achievements. This was the speech Morgan gave during that time. He did tell the students about the current borders of the British Empire, highlighted that during Queen Victoria's reign, the empire conciliated. He acknowledged there were wards and deeds which were not great, however hoped they brought eternal peace. He told the children the British Empire consisted of every race and colour of people. It is essential to recognise all people as brothers, in order not only to establish but maintain world peace. He said that every child has a part to play in creating the empire, with force no longer required but love and forbearance, which is the better tools to wield. Okay, so he said weapons, but we don't have to weaponize everything. In 1934, William was part of the apprenticeship committee, who was able to set some young people on their way in the trades, including Mr. Roberts, who was going to visit the Maffra sugar factory for his dedication to his apprenticeship. Morgan was elected a member of the League of Nations Union. He was also a true scholar, taking every opportunity to increase his knowledge, including attending a lecture in European history in the Yallourn Fire Brigade Hall in 1934 to hear Mr. W.D. Forsyth, who has a Bachelor of Arts, giving his address on anarchy in the grand style of the European state system. Morgan appreciated this so much, he voted to thank Mr. Forsyth. In 1935, after being the head teacher at the secondary college at Yallourn, back then it was called the Higher Education School, he left, transferred to Preston. It appears this was a frequent occurrence. The musical directors of the Orchestral Society from 1937 until 1950s, who put on 3 shows per year, were Florence Mabel Gilder, who was born in Queenscliff, Victoria in 1899 and baptised on the 4th of September 1899 at St George's, was the first born child to Fred, a musician, 24, and Flora, 21. They'd been married a year before Florence showed up. At 15 years old, Florence was confirmed in St Peter's Church in Melbourne on Burke Street. Florence wouldn't remember when her sister Edith followed her the next year and passed away when Florence was 3 years old. Florence studied at the Melbourne Memorial Conservatory. That's its name since 1956. Initially, it was called the Albert Street Conservatorium because it was on Albert Street in East Melbourne. There she mastered the violin under the tutelage of Fritz Hart, a famous composer, writer and teacher who spent time between Australia and Hawaii. Due to her proficiency, she was accepted to the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Her conductor was Professor Bernard Hines and Alberto Zillman. Florence lived in Ascot Vale in 1924, listed on the electoral roll as a musician. Florence married William Francis Connolly in 1927 when she was 27 years old. William Francis was a musician also. However, before that, he was born in 1884 to James, 30, and Anna, 23. James Bennett his brother, was born in Auckland, New Zealand, when Francis was 2 years old. Cyril, his next brother, arrived in 1893 in Alberton, Victoria, not far from Port Albert, when Francis was 8 years old. Basil, his third and last brother, born when he was 14 years old. By 1925, Francis was living in Caulfield, working as a musician. He was 42 years old when he married Florence. The couple did not have children and poured their passion into the Yallourn Orchestra. To live in the Yallourn township and work in the orchestra, Francis had to take up a job with the SEC. So in 1937 he was working as a clerk for the State Electricity Commission. There they lived at 26 Railway Avenue. Florence is listed as undertaking home duties. However, as with Henrietta and the women who supported the efforts of the Emergency Services Fund, Florence would have been working behind the scenes, helping notate and produce events while her husband worked. William Francis conducted the celebrity concert of the first movement of Mozart, pianoforte, in F, and Beethoven's Pathetic Sonata. William enjoyed producing and directing musical comedies, such as Little Nellie Kelly and others. In 1955, William Francis passed away in Yallourn. He was credited with having created much joy and happiness through the art of theatre. After William's death, Florence left Yallourn, returning to Ossett, where she lived until 1968. Then too passed away. The Publican. Since the opening of the Yallourn Hotel in 1927, the first publican was George Dixon Brown. We're going to call him Dixon. He was born in 1888 in Holbrook, New South Wales, 40 miles or 64 kilometres northeast of Albany, New South Wales, to George and Jane Ann. She was more commonly known as Jeannie. Dixon lost his father when he was 15 years old, followed by losing his mother at 21 years old. The pub was one of the few establishments which had to be owned by a civilian and could not be owned by the Commission. There was even a question of legality if the hotel could be built by the Commission. Dixon had experience as a publican. He had managed and owned the Yallourn Hotel, which is 441 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, just south of Mildura, Victoria. He was interested in maintaining a hotel. In 1914, he married Martha Amelia Robertson. Dixon had to go through a lot of work to get the licence for the hotel, and this resulted in several court cases. We'll be looking at these in further depth in the bonus episodes. A suggestion by one of the members of the court was to call the hotel Concord. This was met with laughter, and I don't quite understand the joke. If you do, please let me know. Residents did not want the hotel built close to a church. Others opposed it based on alcohol and crimes. They said come with the sale of alcohol. However, this was quashed as liquor was brought in and sly grog trading was a big problem within the Yallourn area and surrounds. The licence was granted on the 23rd of November 1927 with the intent to have a £30,000 building completed by 1st November 1928. Named the Yallourn Hotel. It was opened a month earlier and application for the licence to start on 2nd October 1928 was granted. At 4 p.m. that day, a line formed on Boulevard Avenue, Yallourn. In 1933, Dixon was granted a spirit merchant's licence for the Brown Coal Mine. He had informed the court there were locals making wine out of blackberries and methylated spirits. This was resulted with laughter, but also an acceptance of his application. In 1937, Martha became unwell and was sent to hospital in Brighton. However, this is where she passed away. He would regularly take time out and spend it with his daughter, including taking her on overseas holidays. In 1943, their daughter Jessie Annette married a young man who'd returned from World War II. I want to tell you now a quick story about a hero. I don't know a lot about him, But in 1927, Reginald Pierce had a cart filled with 15 tons of coal. He had an eagle eye out on the environment around him. As he approached the bridge over the Latrobe River, he saw the land sliding. Immediately he reported it, and the 60 men working in the area were moved away, and work commenced on stabilizing the area. He saved the lives of his colleagues and even the bridge. A Yallourn doctor. A less famous Yallourn doctor is Harry Vivian Francis. He was born 29 November 1902 to his father named Harry and Vivian, a 32-year-old engineer, and his mother Annie May, who was 28, in Elstonwick, Victoria, a suburb of Melbourne. He trained as a doctor at the Queen's College in Carlton, today the Parkville Melbourne University campus. He stayed on campus during his training, which occurred during 1924-1925 definitely. So 1927 would have been one of his first postings when he arrived in Yallourn at 25 years old. In 1928, when the hospital structure was formally organised, he was ranked as second in charge to Dr. James Moore Andrew, who we will be hearing more about in a bonus episode. He worked diligently at the hospital as second in charge. Firstly, in Yallourn, he had time to focus on his personal life, where he met Elaine Constance Keppel. In 1929, Harry was 27 years old and Eileen was 24 when they married. The next year, their daughter Eileen arrived. They gave her her mother's maiden name as her middle name. Harry was also the joint vice president of the Orchestral Society with Henrietta Hunt in 1932. The subscription that year was 10 shillings and 6 dimes. In 1933, he left with his wife and moved to Port Fairy, west of Melbourne. The couple were honoured at many goodbye parties, one by the Girl Guides, the Fire Brigade and the hospital board. Lorraine Johannesson was a Yallourn nurse. She was born in 1904 in Painesville, Victoria, not far from Lake's entrance, to Carl and Sarah. She worked as a nurse in Yallourn from early 1936 until 1945. In 1953, Lorna, along with her sister Valerie Annette Johansson, a typist, inherited their mother's home in Clayton. Lorna still worked as a nurse in 1967 in Carnegie. In 1984, when she passed away, her probate listed her as retired. Mrs. Alice Wilson seems to have encapsulated the behind-the-scenes drive of the women creating culture. Mrs. Wilson was a founding member of the Yallourn Girl Guides, the Country Women's Association, and a founding secretary of the Housewives Association. She organised Sir John Monash to attend an event and lobby the minister and general superintendent about issues facing the women of Yallourn, such as high rents, the cost of food. That in 1936, a thick layer of coal would fall over their properties while they slept. That they would wipe this up in the morning and it would fall again and be just as thick in the afternoon. A layer of grime dust that was a never-ending battle. Even picnicking outside would cause coal to drop on the food. In order to raise awareness for this, she bundled up a package of just the morning's fallings and gave it to the superintendent and asked him to pass it on to Dr. Herman, who was responsible for minimising the emissions from the big briquette factory that was responsible for covering the town in coal dust. Alice died in 1956 and Dr. Andrew wrote a commemoration for her, crediting her establishment of organisations for whose existence would have simply have been taken for granted. A tree was planted in the Broadway Gardens and a plaque commemorated her service to Yallourn. Catherine Anderson was trained as a fitter and turner in Scotland. When she arrived at Yallourn, she was allowed to work at the power station in unskilled positions. The other workers who came from overseas were retrained in Australian standards, not Catherine. In 1939, during World War II, when the men had largely gone off to fight, there was a labour shortage. 3 other women, including Catherine, were allowed to work at Yallourn. Catherine was placed in the tool shed, growing skills and knowledge about the types of tools, sizes of bolts, nuts required for working in the breakout factory. Ruth talks about how she lived in Moe and rode 8Ks on a bike every morning that she worked at Yallourn. She was a good cyclist in those days and would beat the worker bus from Moe. She got up at 5 a.m. and started work at 7 and would work till 5 p.m. She kept the boilers clean. A young scout, a rover. Mr. Davis, at a scouting trip, had reason to become unhappy. His scout leader was demonstrating how to subdue a snake by cracking it like a whip. Holding it from the tail with a dead specimen, the snake connected with the young lad's hand, puncturing the skin. The area almost instantly showed signs of poisoning. Thankfully, the young lad didn't end up like the snake and recovered after first aid. Valuable lessons were learnt that day. 1. To devenom the snake before whirling it around. And the first aid they learned at Scouts works. Thirdly, how to kill a snake. Or maybe that snakes are more worthy adversaries than we give them credit for avenging their death beyond the door. Today, this is not a suggested manner in which to deal with snakes, and most snakes in Australia are protected. This next story isn't about a person, but nuts beneath the coal. The State Electrical Commission, while excavating coal in Yallourn, found something prehistoric at about 200 metres down, determined to be 20 million years old, were extracted. They were like walnuts, except they had 5 divisions, not 4. It couldn't be determined what they grew into, as they were fossilised in the coal. These were sent to Melbourne University for testing. And now we're going to hear about a boilermaker and scout leader. His name was William, and he was born in 1884, the third child of Angus and David Shankland in Scotland, where he completed his boilermaker apprenticeship in 1901. Following in his father's footsteps, William met his younger sibling, the 8th child, who was born when he was 14 years old. In 1910, he married Margaret Dalgleish in Lancashire, Scotland, before coming to Australia. In 1922, they arrived in Brisbane aboard the Jervis Bay ship. Margaret gave birth to a healthy son, William Andrew Shankland, at the Spanish mission-style Yallourn Hospital in 1927. 9 years later, Margaret passed away. At 60 years old, William was still working as a boilermaker and treasurer for the local scouts. William had become very unlucky. One of these occasions resulted in a month off work after he became trapped in a drying shed overnight. The hospital treated him for severe burns, including damage to his lungs and dehydration. 5 months later, back at work, in the workshop performing his duties, when the rolling machine caught his leg, he survived extrication from the machine, the surgery completing the amputation, only to die in hospital in 1945 at 61 years of age. If William had have retired, he would have seen his son get engaged to Kathleen Watson the next year. Thank you for your time. I truly appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about a different time and the people who lived then. Tegan Dawson produced, researched, wrote and narrated this episode on Gunai-Kurnai land in Moe, Victoria. Haunted Hills acknowledges the Bradalong people of the Gunai-Kurnai Nation, who are the traditional custodians on the land they operate on. Much of the country they speak of is Aboriginal land, always was, always is. We respect the elders, people, culture, past, present, and hope for a positive future on all these lands that was never ceded. The intro and outro music was created by Aaron Austin Music. For the patrons, the bonus episode coming up next is of the 1944 Royal Commission into the bushfires that affected the Yallourn area, ranging from as far as Yallourn to Blackwarry, Traralgon and Willong. It will look at how this affected the people, the community, including the people behind the decisions. Next time on Haunted Hills, where you're listening right now, we'll be telling the real crime story of Yallourn. This small town has big stories. Let me know if you like this podcast. Let someone you know. You can chat with us on the socials, Facebook, Haunted Hills Pod, at haunt_hills, or our pod website, Haunted Hills Podcast, or hauntedhillstours.com.au. There you will find a lot of details on our site, including photos and details of places you can visit in real life or virtually relating to this podcast. If you want to get more episodes, to check us out on Patreon, you will get instant access to our bonus episodes and exclusive posts on our website at patreon.com/Haunted Hills. You can also see us on YouTube at Haunted Hills.